Welcome to week 10 of Love Philosophical, Theological, Psychological Perspectives. This week we will be reviewing or going over the Book of Forgiving by Desmond Tutu and Phuong Tutu. No Love Without Forgiveness is the title of this chapter, based on Tutu's book of a similar title. He, of course, was very instrumental in bringing about justice in apartheid, with his justice against apartheid and his prophetic voice and the transformative changes in South Africa. But then he was appointed by Nelson Mandela to lead the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Those kinds of reconciliation commissions, as you know, in Canada, have, as well as other places, they really continue to effect dramatic changes and give us an alternative in dispute resolution. So South Africa provides a context where this creative initiative originated. The hope in this book, in a world that we live in right now, and increasingly as technology advances and it's easier to harm people with weapons, he talks about the hope that enemies can become friends and perpetrators of violence can recover their lost humanity. There's an anthropology there that somehow, in participating in violence, I am losing my humanity. And so when we use the term monster, for example, to describe somebody who's really lost their humanity, Tutu says, no, we shouldn't even call them monsters, because that is to give up hope that they've completely lost their humanity. And though in rhetorical context people might like to say that, we don't want to believe as a human being that people lose their humanity completely. We want to retain that hope that there's some bad in the best of us, and there's some best in the worst of us. And that hope that the human spirit, of course, with grace, this is not a theological book, but they're both priests, so both these authors are aware of the action of grace. Forgiveness is the best form of self-interest. So oftentimes I don't want to forgive somebody because I'm afraid it somehow lets the person off the hook. But as I mentioned in the reading today, quoting that homily that I heard, it lets us off the hook. We're not tethered to this person with our anger, resentment, and fear. And so then we can release them. It's one of the best things we can do for ourselves. However, he goes on to say, forgiveness isn't something that can be forced. It's a process. So in a pastoral context, well, you never know exactly what people have experienced, and so we can talk about forgiveness, but but not to impose it, to invite people to begin to think about, to move on that path. But if they're not ready to forgive, then they shouldn't forgive. In Alcoholics Anonymous, in the 12 steps, there's a step 8 where you become willing to forgive, to ask for forgiveness. And then there's step 9 where you actually do it. So if you're not ready to do it, you just stay willing. And the same thing comes for forgiving people. You can become willing before you actually do it. And again, grace is helpful in affecting the will to move towards forgiveness, but also providing those harmonious, synchronistic opportunities for us to do it and walk away from the context a little lighter. What forgiveness is not. And he's very clear writer, and I encourage you to study this book. I know I wrote a 20-page synopsis of the book, but the book has a lot of very touching anecdotes and examples of events that both authors have faced. Forgiveness is not dependent on the actions of others. The person that have harmed me may never accept my forgiveness, even care if I forgive them. Doesn't matter. I'm letting myself off the hook. Conversely, if I want forgiveness and a person is not willing to forgive me, that is not dependent on the other person. I can have a private ritual, or I can write a letter and not send it to help me move on if I'm feeling remorse about somebody if I've offended and they don't want to receive it. We don't force our forgiveness on other people either if they don't want it. It's not weakness. So we get into the revenge cycle where we think revenge, because our anger makes us feel strong, somehow we think forgiveness is weak. Actually, it's the reverse, as Paul says. Although he's not necessarily referring to forgiveness, he says, my weakness is my strength. Well, you can apply that here. The weakness of forgiveness is actually the strength, because it reverses the cycle of revenge, as we'll see. It's not a subversion of justice. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is one model of how you make people accountable. And we'll say a little bit more about that as we go on. Forgiveness is not forgetting. And I gave that anecdote of when I took a group of students to Dachau concentration camp. Over 20 years ago, I took them. And when we were there, there was a sign in German that basically said, it was put there by the Jewish community in the remains of the Dachau camp. We can forgive, but we will never forget. And they should not forget. And we should not forget what humans are capable of doing to one another. And we can learn from it, moving on with forgiveness and reconciliation. And it's not easy. This is why we don't force it. Forgiveness is not easy because wounds run deep. Think about if there's ever a Truth and Reconciliation Commission between the state of Israel and the state of Palestine. That would take a long time to heal because there's a long history of suffering and wounds there. But we're hopeful because a person from another religious denomination or country is not another species. We're all part of the same common humanity. So the revenge cycle versus the forgiveness cycle. If you want to see the revenge cycle, just watch a martial arts movie. Most of them are on the theme of revenge. Is the person at the end of the movie happier? Well, actually, violence breeds violence. And so if I continue with retaliation, then I will perpetuate the cycle of violence. It continues. However, if I forgive, then it's ended. And I would recommend reading Rene Girard's thoughts on the Paschal Mystery and the death of Jesus, where when Jesus forgives those who have persecuted him, he ends the cycle of violence, and the resurrection vindicates that. It overturns it. Related to this is the retributive justice, which is basically a lot of our justice system insofar as it's a penal system. It punishes you with the presumption that you'll learn because you don't like being punished. that actually doesn't work. What happens, for example, if I'm a criminal, I go to prison, I learn to be a better criminal. Right? So retributive justice forces, perpetuates this revenge cycle, where restorative justice ends it. It would integrate forgiveness into the cycle, and he talks about that near the end of the book. Restorative justice makes people accountable, and there's lots of good examples about that in the book. The forgiveness cycle. They divide it into 4, and I won't go into all of these in detail because they're outlined in my book and in his book. The forgiveness cycle is telling the story, naming the hurt, granting forgiveness, and renewing or releasing the relationship. Telling the story can be very healing. We carry these wounds. So when a dramatic event happens, we can't process it immediately. So it takes time. So eventually, with safe people, you tell the story. I mean, that can be very healing, assuming that the person is listening and is a good listener. So you want to choose the right person to tell the story to. Then there's naming the hurt. Remember, in the healing process, in Jesus' exorcisms, what's the first thing he does when he's exorcising? He names the demon. Well, analogously, we name the hurt. You were betrayed. You were abused. What happened to you was unconscionable. What happened to you was cruel. We name it. Then we can embrace granting forgiveness or not granting forgiveness. And it's a free choice. But as I said in the book, a resentment is taking poison and expecting someone else to die. So do I want to hold on to that poison, or do I want to forgive? And 2 prayers, this isn't two, but I suggested 2 prayers. God, if you're not ready to forgive someone, God, grant me the miracle of your forgiveness, that I may forgive myself, that I may forgive so-and-so for everything he or she has ever done to me, real or imagined. Because we can imagine that people have harmed us, and they really haven't. And there are people that have really harmed us, and so it covers our bases. And then I say, God, grant me the miracle of your forgiveness, I may forgive myself for punishing myself with this resentment and fear. And I'm holding on to it. If that works, use it. If it doesn't, don't use it or change the wording. Okay? And in your pastoral context, these are tools that you can give people. You can ask them to read this book. Finally, there's renewing or releasing the relationship. If you have the opportunity to renew it, and it's important, he says, okay, do it. And he talks about how he went to the funeral of the wife of the former president, the leader of apartheid, because he wanted to extend himself pastorally. A lot of times it's not possible just because of the lives we lead, or is it feasible to release the relationship? If the trust is gone, if there's no trust, and it's not important that you rebuild the trust, then there's no reason to renew the relationship. But if the relationship is important, each situation has to be evaluated. and you decide to renew the relationship, then renew it. Certainly, if you can renew family members, because those relationships are important, loved ones, spouses, significant others, if you can renew those relationships, at least to a point where there's no hard feelings, so to speak, then it's important. He also puts together, he refers to the African philosophy of Ubuntu. I am because you are. And this is a kind of philosophical position, although it's not really been worked out systematically, that could complement Western philosophical epistemologies, which tend to focus on I am. I think, therefore I am. I am because you are. Getting at this interconnectedness, which matches a lot of the teachings in Buddhism that we spoke about last week. We are a common humanity. There's an anecdote in the writings of Emmett Fox where he says, you know, if you watch the media, you're going to think the bad news, it's all bad news. But think about the people you meet throughout the day. Aren't most of the people you meet during the day fairly good people? And aren't those interactions fairly positive and spontaneously good? Because we all have a common humanity. And we have to remember that even the people that do the depravest acts, Tutus are very positive and hopeful. They say that nothing can be forgiven. Or I should say, there's nothing that can't be forgiven. But this takes us to the threshold of a theology of grace. And we will need grace, forgiveness, given for. It's a gift. And it's important to a course on love because it is the lack of forgiveness or the inability to forgive that prevents us from loving. So this chapter, this reading invites us to think about the obstacles to love in our own lives and into our world, and to try to be mediators of forgiveness, and to learn about forgiveness as a textbook, as a formula for healing the wounds in our world.